Welcome! Each week I do a statistical analysis of the data coming in about the coronavirus pandemic. This is a third such analysis for the week ending the 19th of April 2020. And as far as I can see from the data, there is no end in sight. The main headlines this week are that the hydroxychloroquine proved to be fatal, i.e. more people died as a result of taking it than not taking it. So that is off the list at the moment. However, there are other drugs being tested. Some look promising, at least initially, but they have to undergo the same sort of regimen of testing that hydroxychloroquine did to prove that it's both safe and effective. Some countries are flattening the curve, which is good news. However, there are other countries just about to start up that curve, and that's not such good news. Overall, we're about in the same situation as we were last week. The US still leads in the number of cases and the number of deaths. Some places are considering reopening. However, we're not clear whether there's enough testing to make sure that it's safe to do so, and whether, if that testing is not in place, people are willing to start going out to restaurants and sports matches and things of that sort without that assurance. Well, let's take a look at the map and see how all these cases are distributed around the world. This looks very similar to last week's map, except for all the numbers are universally higher. One of the issues is how effective are various countries at their treatment. The US is obviously performing the worst, and why is that? The US, in terms of the number of cases, is greater than Spain, Italy, Germany, the UK and France combined. And then if you take all the rest of the world from France on down, the US is about equivalent to those as well. So basically you can divide the cases into 1/3 in the United States, 1/3 in Europe, and 1/3 in the rest of the world. The US also leads in deaths. That is greater than China, Germany, France and Belgium combined. In terms of lethality, and this is the way I define lethality, which is the number of deaths divided by the number of resolved cases, i.e. those that have been cured, and the number that have died, is 36%. That's much higher than the global average, which is about 21%. And we'll look at those figures in a second. So overall, it looks as though the US has been least effective at preventing the spread of this disease and the least effective in terms of treating this disease so far. So let's take a look at these numbers in a bit more detail and compare what we have this week with last week. Number of cases this week, we have 2.3 million, which is an increase of 26% over last week. Number of deaths is at 161,000. That's an increase of 41%. Recoveries have increased by a similar amount to just over 600,000. Now, lethality is a complicated issue. The normal definition of it is the number of deaths divided by the number of cases, which at the moment is at about 6.9%. However, that number has increased quite significantly over the last few weeks. When I started doing this, it was at 4.3%. So there's something wrong with this. Either the lethality of this disease is getting worse, or which I hope it isn't, or there's something wrong with the numbers, which I highly suspect is the case. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The way I define lethality is the number of deaths divided by the number of resolved cases, i.e. the number of recoveries plus the number of deaths. And that for the last few weeks has been very constant at 21%. Now ideally, as this disease progresses and goes away, these two numbers will asymptotically approach one another somewhere between the two, hopefully at the lower level. But why do I say these numbers are uncertain? Well, first of all, the number of cases depends on the testing that you're doing. Not all countries are doing the same sort of testing or as comprehensively. In fact, state to state in the United States are doing things differently. Similarly, the number of deaths is being handled differently. For example, in the UK, they're not counting, as yet, the number of deaths in nursing homes and in private institutions, only in hospitals. And so that's an underestimate of the number of deaths. Some countries aren't even reporting recoveries, like the UK. So that number is going to be low as well. So all of these feed into this lethality number, which is going to increase the uncertainties on them. But we can only work with what we have, not what we would like. I showed this plot last week. It is a plot of the number of cases as a function of time. We're talking here about the red curve. Now last week I extended that red curve on into the future and predicted that by May the 1st we'd have something like 3 million cases worldwide. Here is the same extension, but now with a week's worth more data, and I see no change in the slope of that curve, and so my prediction, I think, holds. What we're looking for here is for this curve to start bending over to the right, i.e. the number of cases beginning to fall off worldwide. And that hasn't happened yet. Until there is no end of this pandemic in sight. We have some problem areas. Last week it was Europe and the United States that were producing most of the cases. However, South America is beginning to fill in rapidly, particularly in Brazil, where Bolsonaro took this disease very, very lightly initially, and so they may be suffering from that initial reaction. Russia is showing some alarming increases in the number of cases declared. India has so far kept its numbers relatively low, but one wonders about the effect of sending all those migrant workers home to their native rural villages, and whether that has spread the disease throughout the country, particularly into areas that are not being tested widely. The World Health Organization has declared that Africa may well become an epicenter of this disease in the coming weeks, as it is least able to deal with this problem because it doesn't have the facilities that some of the Western countries have, like Europe and the United States. Let's focus on a success story. South Korea. They have the most comprehensive testing, tracing and isolation program of any country, and they've been able to get their curve down to very low numbers. In fact, yesterday they only had 8 new cases, and most of those were from travelers coming in from abroad. The one fly in this ointment is that hundreds of recovered patients are testing positive again for the virus. There are possible reasons for this. Some are good and some are bad. One, which would be most optimal, is that these are just testing errors. Second one is, as sometimes is the case with such viruses, that there's a reservoir of viruses lodged in the body somewhere and they keep resurging. That means you might be a carrier of the disease, but you won't get infected again. The one that would be worrying is if immunity from catching this disease was very short-lived. I keep on hearing from various pundits and even some governors that this is just like the flu, so we shouldn't worry. Here's a figure that should dispel that once and for all. It's a bit complicated, so it's going to need a bit of explanation. That grey curve with the grey shading either side of it is the normal death rate per week in the UK for this time of year. You can see it sort of peaks at the middle of January at about 14,000 and then decays away by the time you get to April to about 10,000 per week. The blue curve is the deadliest outbreak of flu recorded in the UK for quite some time. This was 2015, and you can see it increased the peak in January by about 2,000 a week and went on above that level for about a month, returning to the normal death rate by the beginning of February. The red curve is for 2020. As you can see, up until about the middle of March, it was at or below the level of the average death rate for the UK. But then it suddenly started to rise, and it's not risen by just a couple of thousand like the 2015 outbreak did. It's risen by about 6,000. Now, that is a huge increase. That's 3 times worse than the worst flu outbreak in recent memory. And we don't know how long it will be sustained for, but I think it'll be longer than just a couple of weeks, as the situation was for the 2015 flu epidemic. So this is not like the flu. This is much more contagious and it's much more deadly. So don't believe anybody that's telling you this is just another flu. We do have some good news to spread. Social distancing seems to be working. Where these rules have been most stringent, the numbers have stayed lower than where they haven't. There's a new drug, Remdesivir. The trials look very promising. However, they have to go through the same sort of testing to make sure they're both effective and safe. We can't afford another debacle like we had on hydroxychloroquine. The US projected death rate from the models has dropped to 60,000. While that is good news, I'm not convinced by any of these numbers. As I've stated above, there is a great deal of uncertainty on the numbers going into these models, so there should be even more uncertainty on what's coming out of it. It also pays the politicians to inflate these numbers, so when you get a final death toll, it looks a lot better than it did before, and so they can say they saved 200,000 lives or 150,000 lives or something of that sort by the actions they took, even though it's cost 60,000 lives. The thing I'm most encouraged by is there's global examples of people helping people. For example, there was that old age pensioner in the UK that walked miles and miles and miles around his building to raise money for the national health system and raised over $20 million. That's amazing, and that's the sort of thing that should be happening. I'm only hoping that these sorts of efforts will continue when there's no pandemic instead of just during a pandemic. But on the other side of the coin, we have no vaccine as yet, and the antibody test, according to the World Health Organization, doesn't guarantee immunity. It just guarantees that you've been exposed to the virus. Various financial institutions have been warning of a major worldwide recession. In fact, some countries are already in such a recession. There's no definitive plan for reopening the economy, particularly in the US. There's some aspirational goals, and it's being left to individual governors to decide what to do. However, the problem is that if one of these governors opens up prematurely and starts the spread of the disease again, we'll be back to square one in a few weeks' time. The US unemployment claims has got to surreal levels, with 22 million claims in the last 3 weeks. And remember, those numbers are 2 weeks behind the current date. So there's a great probability that these numbers are way too low. And then there's always the danger of a second wave. And if we open up too prematurely, we'll almost certainly get one. So you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. Above all, stay home, stay safe, and stay healthy. So until next time, goodbye.